Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I wanted to talk about Educated, a memoir by Tara Westover. This memoir revolves around how Tara Westover describes her family that's from Ohio, although her family is a bit unconventional since they live off the grid, even to the point where Tara's mother believes in herbal remedies, as well as not even knowing the exact day in which Tara or some of her siblings were born. There's a scene in here where Tara is actually 16, but her mother's trying to push her to move out because her mother this whole time thinks she's 20 years old. Growing up off the grid, of course, had some of its inconsistencies, especially with things like not knowing when you're born, also meaning that neither Tara or her siblings had a public education. And since this memoir is titled Educated, it is a way for Tara to kind of recount her childhood and find where she is most recently, getting her PhD at Cambridge in England. And what I really like about this memoir is definitely Tara's relationship with her siblings, specifically her brother Tyler, as Tyler is kind of one of her older siblings that inspired her to get an education in the first place. Although of course there are numerous traumatic situations happening in here, one of them actually, as Tara describes, a lot from her own experience, but also her experiences based on her siblings' traumas, like Tyler. Tyler, one time they were driving and it turns out he gets them into a car accident, and it's not really meditated on, but as I was reading through the book, again, kind of taking notes, I almost forgot Tyler did that, and how Tyler is one of the ones to really go off on his own away from the mountain that Tara describes where her family lives. Maybe I interpret it as Tyler feels this sort of guilt to kind of make his family better by being educated after this happens. At the same time, Tara believing that because Tyler's getting an education, that he also makes that sacrifice to not really involve himself in their family anymore. So whether it's traumatic situations from Tara or her siblings, or also sort of the emotional manipulation that Tara's family gives her when it comes to her memories, there's some really profound thoughts in here with how the culture shock is exactly whenever Tara does end up going to college for the first time, as well as being one of the very first times that she's experienced with culture, even to the point where she's sitting in class and her professor mentions the Holocaust, and Tara admittedly mentions that she doesn't know what the Holocaust is. Speaking of memory again, there are moments in here, like I said, where Tara kind of feels pushed to believe certain things that happened to her from her parents or her siblings. And there are numerous times in here where Tara will leave footnotes admitting that some of her memories aren't exactly as how anyone may also describe them. In particular, Tara's brother Sean does get into a car accident, and she mentions one specific person being there that helped her with that accident, but in the footnote she acknowledges that that person she said was there says that he wasn't there at all. So this is a bit concerning to me, just because a lot of this is sort of Tara's self-doubt with believing what happened in her life, and I would have much rather that be fitted more into the memoir rather than in these footnotes, just because at times there is this thing, a scholar named Kathleen Conway, I may have mentioned this in a past video, but there's this thing called a triumph narrative. And basically what a triumph narrative is that whenever people read memoir, it's cited that they become more empathetic, or that they read memoir to feel a bit better about the world, and how memoir has a habit of having this sort of light at the tunnel kind of ending. And while I think this memoir is unique, unlike other memoirs like The Liars Club by Mary Karr, or even The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, I think this memoir kind of stands out because where it is Westover chronicling her whole entire life up to her point now, I think it makes sense that her childhood is probably the most distorted with her memory, where she may not remember, but at the same time, her childhood is where she has the most opportunity to remember certain parts. So this book is told in two parts. The first part is really about Tara describing her childhood, and then the second is the most recent in her memory with her academic success in college. And for me, the second part, while it might be the most fresh in Tara's memory, some things I think happen so instantaneously that I don't feel as affected as I should be about what she's accomplishing based on her childhood. And toward the end of the book, Tara does this thing where she specifically re-mentions how there are parallels between what she explains earlier in the book, and as if she became full circle to the idea that her life is getting better. And for me, that did feel kind of triumph memoir-y. I will also mention that it seems like there are just some other writing strategies in here that I think are somewhat a bit amateurish. Tara Westover doesn't have any sort of degree in creative writing or anything, and I'm not saying people have to have that in order to write about their lives or a memoir. In fact, Tara Westover's history is with a degree in history, and I can clearly see where she was inspired by her life to get a degree in history, just because she does battle with that idea of whether or not her memories were real or not. There's actually one particular passage in here where it's after her brother basically abuses her in one of the many instances, and Tara says, "This moment would define my memory of that night, and of the many nights like it, for a decade. In it, I saw myself as unbreakable, as tender as stone. At first, I merely believed this until one day it became the truth. Then I was able to tell myself, without lying, that it didn't affect me, that he didn't affect me, because nothing affected me. I didn't understand how morbidly right I was, how I had hollowed myself out. For all my obsessing over the consequences of that night, I had misunderstood the vital truth, that it is not affecting me, that was its effect." And speaking again of those profound moments in this memoir, I certainly think that's one of them. I can clearly feel the sense of clarity that Tara feels whenever she has these revelations with her life. Although, at the same time, considering again the numerous physical traumas to her body, whether sort of this abuse from her brother or also things like the car accident, whenever she was in the car with her brother Tyler, her body is literally experiencing these traumas to where I could clearly see it physiologically affecting her memory as well. This actually makes me think again of back to Virginia Woolf in one of my earlier videos, but how Virginia Woolf described these moments of shock when she was younger, whenever she felt she was exposed to trauma. And I think the same is actually happening to Tara as she's trying to articulate the significance of these things, especially how she's not sure how the world really operates in contrast to how her own family operates in her own life. And I really thought this sense of sort of how to determine truth or how to have closure with her family would have felt more of a presence whenever Tara describes her academic life, but I really didn't feel it there. I actually felt more of a disconnect. I wasn't sure if I was reading the same one memoir when I was reading about Tara's academic achievements. I felt like they were certainly connected based on what Tara was studying and how it was influenced by her family and her upbringing, but I didn't feel exactly that they were compatible. I felt like I was almost reading two separate memoirs, one about Tara's culture shock with being raised off the grid, and then the other sort of her upbringing with her family. I think this again is kind of clear sort of for me how disjointed these kind of two different memoirs are. On one hand, because it seems like where Tara's chapters are literally maybe anywhere between 5 to 10 pages, they're very brief. And so I feel like these are just splits in memory rather than feeling like one cohesive memoir. Secondly, it seems like Tara is in a pattern where she ends her chapters in either some form of a metaphor or, again, kind of that spirit where it's I determine my fate, or I'm empowered, and again, kind of recalling back to the whole Triumph memoir. And for me, I think the biggest pitfall of this memoir is how Tara Westover describes her parents in particular. I think it's perfectly okay that Tara Westover sort of resents her parents for how they raised her, and then again, I think how it's being done doesn't provide the most closure. Educated lately has often been compared to other memoirs like The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls or The Liars Club by Mary Karr. And in particular, when I think of Mary Karr and her book The Art of Memoir, she does offer some more advice about how the memoir experience feels more intimate but also still true. And a part that Mary Karr does advise is that when it comes to her own writing, she says things like, "I never speak with authority about how people feel or what their motives were. I may guess at it, but I always let the reader know that's speculative. I keep the focus on my own innards. I let the reader know how subjective my point of view is." And again, I think Tara Westover is doing this in some parts about how she admits that she has gaps in memory about how exactly the memory happened. But I don't know. I think it's kind of easy to sort of let yourself not remember certain things if you didn't also happen to like that specific memory. And just thinking of Tara Westover's family in general, she sometimes does this thing where she presents a situation, but she already gives the resolve by saying something like, I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I could still do it. And I think instead of telling me, the reader, that things like sort of get resolved, I would have much rather have liked to read it as a reading experience to find out how things unfold by myself. But this whole idea of sort of showing the reader instead of telling the reader things, I think Westover is most triumphant whenever she describes her siblings and how her sibling dynamic works. We only really get some insight from only Tara's siblings that make the most impression on her, like her brother Sean, her brother Tyler, and her sister Audrey. And I actually think that's okay. I think it would be kind of weird to feel forced to have to talk about all of your siblings equally if they actually didn't have that much of an impression in your memory. For example, Tara has a brother named Tony who's much older, and we don't really hear a lot about him until later in the book, whenever Tara's much older and that she keeps in touch with certain siblings that she can or wants to. Although again, I do kind of wonder exactly how certain parts that Tara's crafting with her memory, how much they kind of give way to melodrama, and kind of how they do remind us as readers that this is a book that we bought and we want it to kind of have these things that Memoir does have, such as maybe certainly some type of conflict, as well as some certain aspect of success, and how I think I at least want to be conscious of memoirs I'm reading that I think might fall into the triumph memoir or triumph narrative. Overall though, I would say this is a good memoir. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's very readable and accessible, and it does, I think, despite its title, Educated, again, I kind of feel like the parallels are certainly there, but I feel like they're not exactly strong enough to leave a big impression on me, just because I feel like how imbalanced Tara Westover's parts are. Part 1 about her childhood and part 2 about her older life while in college. So that was my review. Please let me know if you have read Educated or if you've actually wanted to read it, because it is kind of new. Furthermore, please do let me know what memoirs you've read, because I'd really love to read more, or if you've also read The Glass Castle or The Liars Club, and what you think of those memoirs in particular too. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.